We need a great reset of capitalism. Those were the words of Klaus Schwab, the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum earlier this summer. In an article published on the World Economic Forum's website, he went on to say how it would work and the outcome. Clearly a big job, but it would require every country to be involved. And within those individual economic units that would have to work together, each and every sector would have to participate. Is this possible? And what are the likely outcomes? Welcome to IG's Trading the Market podcast. I'm Jeremy Naylor. I'm pleased now to be talking to Mark Oswald, Chief Economist at ADM ISI, about this. Mark, it's great to catch up with you, and someone who has a global vision and a global reach as you do in your economic forecasting and what you look at on a day-to-day basis. You are probably one of the better people to ask. Is this sort of thing going to happen?
Well, I think there'll be aspects of it which will happen perhaps more inadvertently and by just the force of what is happening to us at the moment, because we are going to go through huge economic change. There's no doubt about it. We've discovered that there's whole areas which we weren't really aware that we were either just scratching the surface. We've been within the technological revolution for 30 years. And yet what the pandemic has revealed to us is that we've been paying lip service to that technological revolution. I think the basic tenet here of trying to reset the way that we run economies and the assumptions on it is not wrong. It's not something that actually hasn't been brewing for quite some time. The forces railing against globalization have been very loud. The forces that have basically spoken to the fact that we've got a very, very unequal world, and the fact that we also have economic data which simply isn't fit for purpose. GDP is, in simple terms, a very, very broad measure which captures the output of a nation, but it doesn't say anything about how well the individual person is doing, or even different social strata within that. So there is a great need for this. And I think the important thing, actually, in terms of what COVID has revealed is, for instance, let's take education. I think that's probably one of the best examples beyond healthcare. We've had a lot of people doing virtual education or being schooled at home. Well, this is hugely problematic if you go down the social scales, talking about access to technology actually being very, very heavily differentiated. And therefore, you're only going to effectively re-emphasize those inequalities that there are in the world. So it's enormously complex task, and it's enormously complex challenge. The other part of it, obviously, is going to be not just education in terms of schooling, but also re-educating and retraining the workforce. We are basically coming to the point where we realize that there are large parts of the service sector, which in most countries constitutes about 70% of economic output, which are simply not going to recover to the sort of levels of activity that they were before. By implication, that means obviously that there will be quite a sharp rise in unemployment, and we need to start thinking about how we are going to redeploy those people. What areas do we need more people?
But surely this is about resetting the entire economic infrastructure, isn't it? I mean, is the reset in its theoretical base there to try and make everything fairer, or is it to rebase us all back to a more realistic environment economically and more realistic expectations? What is the ultimate goal here of an economic reset?
Well, I mean, within the WEF proposal, it is definitely to make a more cooperative world, a fairer world, a more equal world. That's laudable. It's very ambitious, and it's very difficult to achieve in the current political environment. We have populists in charge in so many countries, and in a certain sense, there is an element here, which is there's some irony. To institute an economic reset, what you need is decisiveness, which is basically what people who are voting for populists are voting for people to say, make things better and do it now. So there is very much an opportunity there. On the other hand, a lot of this economic reset that they're talking about relies on a huge amount of cooperation. And that's where my question would be. I think ultimately there will be greater cooperation because as we face this down, the economic scars from the pandemic, so we will be in a situation where people start to realize that they need to cooperate much more and much more closely. There's going to be a question very, very soon, to my way of thinking, which is going to be asking, why haven't all the world's resources in terms of vaccine development been pooled? Why hasn't all the scientists working together? Why haven't politicians instituted this as a very simple goal? And it's a very good question. And I think eventually, if it takes a lot longer and the economic harm becomes that much worse, because a lot of what we've got at the moment is supposedly temporary. I debate whether it proves to be temporary. But what we will need, and it's going to be, again, perhaps, the popular movements that we're seeing, the popular protests, will actually drive some of this. But we probably are lacking in the sort of statesmen who are needed to lead it.
So the way I get the message here is that it's going to be something that ultimately we'll have to face. Is there any suggestion, do you think, amongst those that are calling for this, that if we don't do it in a managed way, it will happen in any way by default, because we cannot continue on the trajectory that we've set ourselves? If I go back to the great financial crisis of 10, 12 years ago, there were many then saying that this was going to see a massive shakeout of a number of businesses and a new way of doing things. And that never happened. And there are still those that are even today saying we still haven't had a proper repair of the great financial crisis because it wasn't allowed to happen economically. There wasn't allowed to be that transition. Central bankers and governments stepped in, as we know, with enormous amounts of money to help economies, but the fault lines were still very much there. Is the problem here, do you think ultimately that now we don't have any sort of firepower left, be it from governments or from central banks, that we could end up with a situation where an economic reset happens because no one can stop it?
To a certain extent. I mean, I think your point is very well made about the global financial crisis, for the simple reason that what we did at the time is say we cannot allow the financial system to collapse. We had one example of our Lehman's, and at that point, the central bankers and the politicians basically said, we cannot allow this to happen. I think basically it's going to have to happen. It de facto is going to have to happen, because at the moment, all we've got is a lot of monetary policy, basically fueling renewed asset price inflation after a minor wobble, when one looks at it in proper historical context in February, March. And we're sustaining a system which simply doesn't work. And part of the problem is not actually what they went to address afterwards. The regulation, which was introduced post-global financial crisis, basically decided that it was the banks which were the problem. Actually, that was a misdiagnosis. To a certain extent it was, but it was actually the instrumentation in financial markets which was the problem. And some of it, basically, they should have just gone after and said, no, we're not going to have this sort of thing. So at some point, the biggest feature of the moment is the fact that we've had this huge fiscal stimulus. We've had record levels of corporate borrowing this year, both in terms of investment grade and in terms of high yield and leveraged loans. And you look at it and go, well, on what basis are we lending to people? And the answer is, well, with interest rates so low, I need a better return on something. So it's all very focused on the financial world, and it's not really focused on Main Street. And that's where this inequality then becomes, again, very, very evident. Access to finance is extraordinarily differentiated. We are piling on these furlough schemes, which ultimately, yes, they have to do that to protect the economies. Otherwise, you're going to have mass unemployment, and that will definitely reset everything. It's not going to be just a question of a big sort of New Deal type thing a la Roosevelt. It's basically just going to force politicians, it will force a lot of the political fraternity out of their jobs, because ultimately there is one truth in terms of politics, and people vote with their pockets. They don't vote for policies or anything, they vote with their pockets. But in piling up all of this debt, at some point there is going to be this question, well, when's it going to be repaid?
That's the interesting point here, isn't it? Is this really all about debt? Is this economic reset everybody's talking about all just a way to find a way to render down the enormous amounts of debt that's hanging around governments, around corporates, individuals? Because unless you have rampant inflation or you have a massive debasement of currencies, and of course that's got two sides to it, you really can't see a way through getting rid of this debt pile. My question is to wonder whether or not there is some sort of worry about the debt pile, which is really driving these calls for an economic reset. Nothing else. Do you think there's any value in that, or do you think that's just too simplistic?
I think it's certainly part of the equation. I don't think it's necessarily a motivating force. I think the biggest motivating force is definitely to do with inequality in every aspect that one can think of. It's inequality in terms of access to healthcare. It's inequality in terms of access to education, to work skills. I think that's what drives it. But the debt aspect of it is definitely something which is going to happen, because at some stage, we are going to basically get back to whatever the new normal is going to be. Because if we're trying to row back to whatever the old normal was, and we didn't really establish a new normal post GFC, then we are blowing smoke effectively. It's simply not going to happen that way. So what needs to be done at some stage is to have a massive write-down of some of this debt, because, other than that, part of the economic reset needs to come with an unburdening, particularly of consumers, of debt. We need to, at some stage, also get to this point where housing becomes more affordable, because in so many countries, and again, this is another inequality, it's not. That it's going to be necessarily fair and equal, I very much doubt.
Yeah, we're talking here, aren't we, when we're looking at the global picture, the fairness between economies, the fact that the US remains one of the biggest and strongest economies in the world. It has been in that position for so many decades now. And of course, we look at places like the most worrisome aspects of the African subcontinent, where they have virtually nothing. And we hear about companies in America that are worth many more times the value of some of the economies in Africa, which cannot be right. But my wondering is whether perhaps maybe there might even be something else going on here, not just the debt thing. It might also be something about the way in which we live. It is this idea about sustainability. Do you think that ultimately could well end up driving some sort of economic reset? The fact that the oil and gas sector is still too big. They're not diversifying fast enough. They're not engaging with the green and environmentally friendly way of powering our homes, our cars, our lives generally. And the fact that we need to find a more sustainable way of doing it. Again, you've got to look at the difficulties in getting that done. The oil companies are still powerful. The renewable business is still in its infancy. It's difficult to see how anybody is going to generate enough interest in getting this thing done in any one go and across nations.
Well, I think there's sort of 3 or 4 different aspects to this, so I'll try and address them one by one. In terms of cooperation across nations, I think one of the most notable aspects, and this has been noted by the UN and a lot of the development banks, is actually what you're seeing in terms of changing the way that we look at energy, the environment, social governance. It's actually been done much more guided by cities, the big metropolises of the world, because that's where actually a lot of the biggest inequalities are. And I think, it's a train which is in motion. I think the most interesting aspect on this front, yes, I'm sure the traditional oil and gas sector still has a lot of influence, and the phasing out period, you only have to look at how we went from wood to oil and gas. That took over 150 years. So this is not something which is going to happen overnight. But I think it is work in progress. And I think this is where the EU's plan, its big hydrogen project, is going to be enormous. I think that there's a different aspect here, which traditionally is associated with wartime. if you're in peace times, vested interests have a lot of control over politicians and the political fraternity, none more so than now. However, when you basically get to the point where things are just not working, when you've got the sort of economic damage that we're basically probably going to have to face down, a lot of those vested interests lobbying for their own interests basically falls by the wayside, because ultimately governments need people to support them. And the vested interests may be providing a lot of the capital, so to speak, but they're not going to keep them in power. So things like the big hydrogen projects and these renewable projects are going to actually be the things which drive change. Now, the hydrogen project obviously is a very long-term one, where we are miles away from getting it to anything where it makes a significant contribution. But when you actually look what's underlying it, we were already going towards electric vehicles. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles seem to be in development. You've got people like Airbus looking at hydrogen fuel cell powered aircraft. They've already put 3 prototypes out there in the world. So these things are happening. What we probably need, though, in the first place is to deal with much simpler issues which have been exposed, like access to education, like access to technology across all people. We know we need many more coders in the world, so there's a retraining program there. We also know in most countries that healthcare is very inadequate. That's been the biggest exposure, and there's nothing, if you're talking about looking after the interests of your general public, healthcare and education probably sit right at the very, very top in terms of the public feeling safe and living in an environment where there is some form of opportunity. I'm not necessarily suggesting that it's equal.
If you can keep your head.
When all about you are losing theirs,
what possibilities might you see?
If you can see it,
The world is yours to trade and invest. See it, IG it.
Let's move away from some of the sort of philosophical aspects of the political and indeed the inter-country relationships and take a look, if I can, at how you see things moving in terms of some of the economic fundamentals like currencies, for example. How can we possibly have an economic reset if we've got different currencies around the world? You talk about the Eurozone, and the Eurozone to some degree has done a really good job in bringing together this monetary diversity that we'd had across Europe in bringing together these currencies. For whatever its faults, the Eurozone has done very well in doing that. And that would, in theory, make it a lot easier to have an economic reset within the Eurozone, for example. Not outside that, because you have currency movements working against you. Do you think that the fact that we've got these currencies working against each other all the time in the markets could actually form some sort of economic barrier to getting some sort of reset underway and completed?
Currency movements do make a difference. I mean, I think that the currency aspect works at two different levels. If everyone in the developed world, and I stress I'm talking strictly about the developed world, cuts interest rates to zero, which is basically what they've all done, then the main instrument for currency adjustment is via interest rates. And at the moment, what we've got the prospect of is interest rates being at zero or slightly negative or slightly positive across the developed world. So no one can really actually do anything with that. A bit more QE, a bit more support for their economies. To a certain extent, yes, that will make a marginal difference. But really what's powering things at the moment in terms of the currency markets for the developed world is much more politics. The sense that people are achieving something, that certain countries have certain advantages, like the dollar with its reserve and funding status. In the developing world, in the emerging markets, on the other hand, what we've seen is some very, very sharp resets of some of the currencies there, in no small part because they too have started cutting their interest rates down to levels where the idea that you're willing to take the risk of investing in an emerging market, with a few exceptions, obviously, some in South America, above all Argentina, most interest rates have been reduced to somewhere in the low single digits. So there isn't any great carry there. So I think currencies do play a role, but I think ultimately it's actually going to be the debt burdens and the ability to service those debt burdens, which will actually be driving a lot of the currency movements. You're seeing it already. And politics, you only have to look at the moves that we've seen in the Turkish lira and the Russian ruble recently, simply because of the Azerbaijan and Armenia tensions.
One final question, just to bring this up and wrap it all together, and ask you the question: do you see a successful economic reset ever happening in our lifetimes? I mean, there may be small ones, there may be regional ones, there may be sectoral ones, I don't know. But in terms of a global reset, realistically, do you see it happening?
A global reset, I have my doubts, simply because of the lack of cooperation at the moment, and simply because without the cooperation, you can't actually drive things forward. The problem with protectionism, the good example in all of this is technology. The big struggle between the US and China at the moment is basically boiling down to a technological fight. Now, the problem with a technological fight, and we've got the example from not very long ago, is if you suddenly start to restrict access to technology on a country or regional basis, what you've got is essentially a Cold War type situation where every time someone sort of said, I don't like what they're doing with that technology, it's a matter of national security. And basically companies who are developing it become appropriated. There's no international cooperation. As much as I don't think we can put the genie back in the bottle of the technological revolution that we've seen over the last 30 years, its further development and its contribution to this economic reset will become stifled unless there is better cooperation, and it will become above all stifled if everybody starts restricting things to each other. The question is, how much can we actually restrict? The rhetoric which is coming out of the US and China, sometimes you look at it and think, actually, do you really believe that you can put a lid on this? Because I'm not so sure that they can. And by that fact is also some hope for that economic reset, because to some extent, if they can't restrict it, then we will carry on with the technological revolution. And I think it needs to be broadened out into so many areas, above all energy and healthcare and education. And that will happen in any case.
Yeah, look, it's a fascinating subject, Mark, and it probably deserves more of the time than we've given to it, but we don't have any more time, unfortunately. But thank you so much indeed for joining us with a look at that. And however good an economic reset may be for us all globally, clearly, it will be a very difficult event to coordinate. That's Mark Oswald, Chief Economist at ADM ISI, with today's IG Trade in the Markets podcast. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGTV and subscribe to our YouTube channel.